The room was silent. Not the comfortable silence of people waiting politely for someone to speak, but the heavy, almost physical silence that settles over a place when everyone present understands that they are about to witness something that cannot be undone. The Grand Assembly Chamber of the United Terran Council had seen many historic moments over the past 2 centuries. Wars had been declared here. Alliances had been signed here. Entire colonial policies had been rewritten inside these walls. But never in the history of the Council, had the chamber been this full. Every seat in the vast circular hall was occupied. Diplomats sat shoulder to shoulder beside fleet admirals. Scientists from the frontier research stations sat beside colonial governors who had spent decades living on distant worlds. Military advisors, political analysts, and representatives from every Terran colony across known space filled the curved rows of the chamber. Above them, a ring of observation galleries held hundreds more. And yet, despite the sheer number of people present, the chamber remained perfectly still. Because everyone was looking at the same person. Secretary General Anika Vasquez stood at the central podium. She was not a tall woman, and her presence did not rely on dramatic gestures or raised voices. Her short gray hair framed a calm, steady face that had appeared on news networks across human space for nearly 15 years. Her reputation had been built slowly. Patient negotiations. Careful decisions. Quiet diplomacy. The kind of leadership that rarely made headlines but shaped the course of civilizations. Tonight, however, the entire galaxy was watching her. Behind the podium, filling the enormous curved wall of the chamber, a single image dominated the display. A map of human space. It stretched across the screen in glowing lines of light, hundreds of star systems connected by trade routes, patrol corridors, and communication relays. Gold lights marked Terran colonies. Blue lights marked orbital stations. White lights marked deep space research platforms. 2 centuries of expansion. 2 centuries of work. 2 centuries of humanity pushing outward from a single small blue planet and slowly, carefully building a presence among the stars. But tonight, the map showed something new. A thick red boundary line. The line curved through space in a perfect sphere. It surrounded everything humanity had built. Every colony. Every station. Every shipyard. Every mining operation. Every orbital defense grid. At the center of that sphere sat one small glowing point labeled simply, so, the birthplace of humanity. The red line extended 300 light-years in every direction. 47 star systems lay inside it. 47 systems that now represented everything humanity called home. Secretary General Vasquez rested both hands lightly on the podium and looked out across the chamber. She did not appear nervous. In fact, the expression on her face suggested something closer to quiet certainty. The certainty of someone who had spent years preparing for this exact moment. Across the front row of the chamber, Fleet Admiral Darius Kale sat with his arms folded, his expression unreadable. A veteran of dozens of border conflicts and the current commander of Terran deep space defense operations, Kale had been present at many council sessions over the years. But even he had never seen the room like this. Every eye fixed forward. Every breath held. Waiting. Vasquez leaned slightly closer to the microphone. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the chamber and across every broadcast channel connected to the Terran communication network. It was calm. Measured. Almost gentle. But there was no hesitation in it. Members of the United Terran Council, she began. Her voice echoed softly through the vast hall. Representatives of the Terran colonies, commanders of the defense fleets, and citizens of Earth and her worlds. She paused. Not for dramatic effect. Simply to let the moment settle. Because she knew that somewhere far beyond the chamber walls, the signal carrying her words was spreading outward through space. Relayed by communication satellites. Captured by listening stations. Recorded by alien governments who had long ago learned to monitor every major Terran transmission. This message was not only for humanity. It was for the galaxy. Vasquez turned slightly and gestured toward the map behind her. The red boundary line glowed brighter. For 200 years, she continued, humanity has expanded beyond Earth. We have built colonies on distant worlds. We have constructed stations in the deep void between stars. We have explored regions of space that were once only points of light in the night sky. The chamber remained silent. Everyone already knew this history. But they also knew something else. Humanity had not expanded without resistance. Border disputes, trade conflicts, political pressure from older, larger civilizations that had been traveling the stars long before humanity had even discovered faster-than-light travel. Many species had tolerated humanity. Few had truly respected it. Vasquez continued. For 200 years, we have attempted to build relationships with our neighbors. We have negotiated treaties. We have opened trade routes. We have respected the borders of other civilizations. Her gaze moved slowly across the assembly. And in return, she said quietly, our own borders have been treated as optional. That statement hung in the air. Because everyone in the room knew it was true. Unauthorized vessels entering Terran systems. Mining corporations from alien powers extracting resources just outside human colonies. Military patrols from older empires drifting dangerously close to Terran space, close enough to remind humanity who truly held power in the galaxy. Until now. Vasquez looked back at the glowing red boundary. Then she faced the chamber again. Her voice did not change. It remained calm, measured, steady. Tonight, she said, that changes. Across the galaxy, communication networks recorded the words. Inside the council chamber, not a single person moved. Secretary General Anika Vasquez straightened slightly at the podium. And then she spoke the sentence that would alter the balance of power in the known galaxy. By the authority of the United Terran Council, she said, and on behalf of all citizens of Earth and her colonies. Her eyes lifted to the red boundary line behind her. I hereby issue the Galactic Declaration of Terran Sovereignty. The chamber did not react. Not yet. Because everyone understood something important. The declaration itself was not the real moment. The real moment was what would come next. And every person in that room knew it. The words settled over the chamber like gravity. For a brief moment after Secretary General Vasquez spoke them, nothing happened. No one moved. No one whispered. Even the air in the vast council chamber seemed to hold still. Behind her, the red boundary line on the map pulsed once. Then it expanded slightly, highlighting the sphere of space surrounding human territory. Vasquez rested her hands calmly on the podium and continued speaking. All space within the boundary displayed behind me, she said, all star systems, stations, transit routes, and interstellar regions extending 300 light-years from the Sol system, are hereby declared Terran's sovereign space. A quiet ripple moved through the chamber. Some of the diplomats exchanged glances. A few military officers leaned forward slightly in their seats. But no one interrupted. Vasquez's voice remained calm. From this moment forward, she continued, any vessel belonging to a non-Terran government that enters this region without prior authorization from the United Terran Council will be considered a hostile incursion. The words were simple, but their meaning was enormous. Because the red sphere behind her did not represent a single star system. It represented dozens. Entire trade corridors passed through that region of space. Merchant convoys, exploration vessels, and military patrol fleets from other civilizations had used those routes for decades. Some of them had been doing so long before humanity had even arrived in the region. And now, humanity was closing the door. Vasquez continued. The response to any unauthorized entry will be immediate. She paused, then finished the sentence with quiet finality. It will be total. Across the chamber, Fleet Admiral Kale watched the room carefully. Some people looked relieved. Others looked uneasy. Several of the colonial representatives looked as if they were struggling to fully grasp the scale of what had just been announced. Vasquez raised one hand slightly, signaling that she was not finished. There will be no warning shots, she said. No negotiations once the boundary is crossed. Her eyes moved slowly across the assembly. There will be no second warning. The chamber remained silent, because everyone in the room understood exactly what she had just done. Humanity had just drawn a line in the galaxy. Not a diplomatic suggestion. Not a negotiable request. A line backed by the promise of force. Vasquez leaned slightly closer to the microphone. This declaration is not an act of aggression, she said. It is an act of protection. She gestured toward the map again. For 2 centuries, humanity has grown among the stars while respecting the sovereignty of every other civilization we have encountered. We have followed their laws. We have honored their boundaries. Her voice did not rise, but the weight in it increased. We now expect the same respect in return. Behind her, the red sphere glowed brighter. The communication satellites orbiting Earth had already begun transmitting the declaration across every Terran broadcast network. But the message was not stopping at human space. Long-range transmitters carried the signal outward across interstellar distances. Across every known diplomatic frequency. Across every language humanity had learned since first contact. Across every communication band used by the major powers of the galaxy. Within minutes, the message would reach alien listening posts orbiting distant stars. Within hours, it would be replayed in the halls of foreign governments. Within days, every civilization capable of receiving radio or subspace transmissions would hear the same calm, unmistakable message. Humanity had drawn a border, and they were willing to fight to enforce it. Inside the council chamber, Vasquez finished her statement. All vessels currently operating within Terran sovereign space that are not registered with the United Terran Council are instructed to exit the boundary within 6 months. She paused one final time. After that point, she said quietly, the Terran Defense Forces will assume that any remaining unauthorized ships have chosen to ignore this declaration. She straightened slightly. And they will respond accordingly. Then she stepped back from the podium. For a single heartbeat, the chamber remained perfectly still. Then the room exploded into sound. Not cheering, not applause, but the chaotic roar of hundreds of voices speaking at once. Advisors leaned toward each other, whispering urgently. Diplomats began pulling up data displays. Military officers tapped commands into personal terminals, already calculating the implications. Across the front row, Admiral Kale remained seated. He did not react. He simply watched the red sphere glowing behind the podium. Because unlike many of the people in the chamber, he already knew something important. The declaration had not been made in confidence. It had been made in preparation. Humanity was not hoping the galaxy would respect the boundary. Humanity was ready if they didn't. And somewhere far beyond the walls of the council chamber, the message was already traveling through the stars. The message reached the first alien listening station 12 minutes after it left Earth. It arrived as a routine diplomatic broadcast, one of thousands transmitted between civilizations every day. The automated translation systems processed the signal, converted the Terran language into standard galactic trade dialects, and forwarded it to the nearest government relay. Within an hour, the declaration had spread across half a dozen interstellar communication networks. Within a day, it had reached most of the major civilizations in known space. And almost everywhere it arrived, the reaction was the same. Amusement. The Breath Collective. Deep in the outer spiral arm of the galaxy, inside a cluster of dark nebulae where the Breath Collective maintained its central communication nodes, the Terran transmission arrived and was immediately absorbed into the vast network of the Breath consciousness. The Breath were not individuals. They were a hive mind, millions of biological bodies connected through a shared neural system that allowed them to process information collectively. When the human declaration entered their network, it was analyzed simultaneously by thousands of breath nodes. The data moved through the shared consciousness in rapid pulses. Terran civilization. Estimated technological age, young. Expansion pattern, moderate. Military capability, limited. The conclusion formed almost instantly. The humans were posturing, a behavioral trait the Breath had observed before. Humans frequently used dramatic statements as a negotiation tactic. Loud declarations. Aggressive warnings. Then quiet compromise. The collective archived the message under a standard monitoring category. Low threat, observe passively. The network moved on to more important matters. The chorus of Kel. Several thousand light-years away, In a region of space occupied by a civilization known as the Chorus of Kel, the reaction was slightly different. The Kel had been traveling between stars for nearly 8,000 years. Their cities floated around ancient suns. Their diplomatic networks stretched across dozens of civilizations. They had seen younger species arrive before. Ambitious ones. Loud ones. Species that believed the galaxy would rearrange itself around their sudden appearance. When the Terran Declaration reached the central council chamber of the Kel homeworld, the message was played once for the assembled elders. The tall, graceful Kel listened carefully. Their long silver robes moved softly as they shifted in their seats. When the recording finished, the chamber remained quiet for several seconds. Then one of the elders spoke. "They have drawn a border in empty space." Another elder nodded slowly. "Yes." A third elder tilted their head slightly. "And they believe they can enforce it." Soft laughter spread through the chamber. Not cruel laughter. Just the patient amusement of a civilization that had existed long enough to see the same mistake repeated many times. The council's secretary recorded a brief internal note. Observation: Terran civilization demonstrating typical young species territorial behavior. Recommendation: acknowledge the declaration politely. No further action required. The matter was closed. The Sun Republic. Not every civilization dismissed the message quite so quickly. Near the outer edge of the Terran boundary existed a small coalition known as the Sun Republic. Unlike the massive empires of the galaxy, the Republic controlled only 3 star systems. But those systems sat dangerously close to the new Terran border. When the declaration arrived, the Republic Council ordered a full intelligence review. The task was assigned to a senior analyst named Priya. Priya spent 3 days examining every piece of available information about Terran military capability, human ship production, defense budgets, colonial infrastructure, border patrol records, everything the Republic intelligence archives had collected over the past 2 centuries. The deeper she looked, the more uncomfortable she became. Not because humanity appeared weak, but because something didn't quite add up. There were gaps in the data. Large gaps. Certain industrial outputs were significantly higher than what their visible fleets would require. Several mining operations inside Terran territory were extracting materials typically used for heavy military construction. And yet, very few new warships had been publicly launched. Priya finished her report late at night. Her final conclusion was short. We do not possess sufficient intelligence to accurately assess Terran defensive capability. She added one final recommendation. I advise the Republic to respect the Terran boundary until further information becomes available. The Council reviewed the report the next day. They thanked her for her work. Then they archived it and moved on to the next agenda item. The sovereign hegemony. The final reaction came from the most powerful government in known space. The sovereign hegemony. An empire that ruled over 800 star systems. Its fleets had conquered entire civilizations. Its emperors had dictated trade laws for half the galaxy. The Terran transmission arrived at the imperial court during a celebration banquet. Emperor Varric Sallant, his four, was seated at the center of a massive stone hall carved from the interior of a conquered world. Music played softly. Servants moved between tables carrying elaborate dishes. When the Terran Declaration reached the court, one of the Emperor's advisors stepped forward and quietly explained the message. The Emperor listened while finishing the last bite of food on his plate. When the translation ended, he leaned back in his chair. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he laughed. It was not loud laughter. Just a short, dismissive sound. The kind of laugh powerful men make when something is too ridiculous to take seriously. A young species, he said, drawing borders in the dark. Several of the court officials chuckled politely. The Emperor waved one hand lazily. File the message. The advisor bowed. The Terran Declaration was entered into the imperial archives. Then the music resumed, and the Empire returned to its celebration. Back in human space. Far away from the imperial court, inside the bridge of the Terran warship TFS Unbroken, Admiral Darius Kale watched the reactions arrive in real time. Diplomatic responses. Intelligence reports. recorded statements from alien governments. He read them quietly, one by one. Then he turned away from the console and looked out through the forward viewport at the distant stars. Commander Tsila Park stood beside him. Most of them think it's a bluff, she said. Kale nodded slightly. Yes. Park folded her arms. Are they wrong? Kale did not answer immediately. Outside the ship, the stars drifted slowly as the Unbroken continued its patrol route along the Terran border. Finally he spoke. No. Park raised an eyebrow. No. Kale allowed himself a faint smile. They're not wrong about the bluff. He looked back at the red boundary line glowing on the navigation display. They're wrong about what happens when the bluff gets called. Park studied his expression for a moment. Then she looked out at the stars. Somewhere beyond those stars, someone would eventually cross the line. And when they did, the galaxy would discover something it had completely overlooked. What humanity had been building in the dark point 6 months past. The declaration did not fade. It did not soften. And it did not change. The red boundary surrounding Terran space remained active on every diplomatic star chart in the galaxy. Merchant ships adjusted their routes to avoid it. Survey vessels gave it a wide berth. Most governments simply ignored it, because ignoring it was easier than admitting the possibility that humanity might actually mean what it said. Inside Terran space, however, things were very different. Far from Earth, beyond the busy trade lanes and civilian transport routes, a region of space known as the Vega Corridor remained quiet. To outside observers, it was nothing special. A wide passage between two dense star clusters. Navigation computers across the galaxy had identified it long ago as one of the most efficient transit routes through the region. Large fleets could move through it quickly without worrying about gravitational interference or hazardous debris fields. It was in every way a perfect corridor for ships traveling across Terran territory. And for 20 years, humanity had been quietly preparing it. The station that didn't exist. Hidden inside a hollow asteroid deep within the corridor sat a facility that did not appear on any official star map. From the outside, the asteroid looked ordinary. Cold rock drifting through empty space. But inside, hundreds of meters beneath its surface, lights glowed across a vast command center filled with Terran officers and technicians. Rows of holographic displays covered the walls. Every screen tracked the same thing. The border. Admiral Darius Kale stood at the center of the room. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes moved constantly across the data streams surrounding him. Sensor networks. Long-range surveillance grids. Traffic monitors. Everything entering or leaving Terran space. Commander Tsila Park approached from behind. All outer sensor arrays are still quiet, she said. Kale nodded slightly. Expected. Park glanced at the central display. Hundreds of small markers blinked across the map. Each one represented a Terran monitoring satellite or deep space sensor platform. Most of them had been placed there years ago. Carefully, quietly, and always just far enough apart that no outside observer would realize how complete the coverage really was. Park lowered her voice slightly. Do you think they'll come? Kale didn't answer immediately. Instead, he zoomed the display outward. The map expanded, showing the entire Terran sovereign sphere. 47 star systems. Hundreds of installations. Thousands of defense points. Then he zoomed in again. Back to the Vega Corridor. A long, empty stretch of space. Except it wasn't empty. It only looked that way. They will, Kale said finally. Park tilted her head. Why? Kale rested one hand on the edge of the display table. Because pride is predictable. 20 years in the dark. 20 years earlier, the Terran Council had made a quiet decision. At the time, humanity had already experienced dozens of border incidents. Alien patrol fleets drifting into Terran mining zones. Foreign corporations attempting to extract resources from unclaimed asteroids near human colonies. Occasional military navigation exercises that just happened to occur inside Terran transit corridors. None of it had been technically illegal, but all of it had carried the same message. Humanity was tolerated, not respected. So the Council had chosen a different strategy. They stopped arguing. They stopped protesting. They stopped demanding recognition. They started building. The defense grid. The first stage of the project had been simple. Sensors. Hundreds of them. Placed quietly along the most likely approach corridors into Terran space. Then came the second stage. Platforms. Not ships. Ships were expensive, visible, and politically complicated. Platforms could be constructed slowly, piece by piece, delivered in sections by unmanned cargo transports, assembled silently in deep space where no one was looking. Over 2 decades, thousands of automated defense platforms had been installed, each one equipped with advanced shielding, long-range weapon systems, and sensor-baffling technology designed to make them invisible to conventional scans. But the platforms were only part of the system, because they weren't the real weapon. The mind behind the grid. Deep within the asteroid station, a section of the command center was sealed behind reinforced glass walls. Inside that chamber sat a cluster of enormous quantum processors connected to hundreds of glowing data conduits. This was Aegis, the artificial engagement and grid intelligence system, the AI responsible for coordinating the entire Terran defense network. Aegis did not command ships the way traditional admirals did. It controlled space itself. Every platform, every sensor, every defense satellite, every piece of infrastructure hidden across Terran territory. When the grid activated, Aegis could track thousands of targets simultaneously and coordinate defensive fire with precision no organic commander could match. Park glanced toward the processor chamber. Aegis is still running predictive simulations, she said. Kale nodded. Good. Current probability of a boundary violation? 68% within the next 12 months. Park raised an eyebrow. That high? Kale allowed himself a small smile. Empires don't like being told where they can't go. The Deep Fleet. Park walked around the display table. What about the Deep Fleet? Kale zoomed the display again. New markers appeared. Dozens of them. Hidden far deeper inside Terran territory. These ships haven't moved in years, she said. They don't need to. The Deep Fleet was humanity's final layer of defense. Warships far larger and more powerful than anything the Terran Defense Forces had publicly revealed. They were stationed in carefully chosen positions throughout the corridor, using advanced sensor baffling systems that made them nearly impossible to detect unless they wanted to be seen. Their crews rotated every few months. Quiet transfers. Unmarked transports. No public records. For 2 decades, the ships had remained there. Waiting. Training. Preparing for a battle that might never come. Or might arrive tomorrow. The waiting game. Park folded her arms. 20 years, she said quietly. Do you ever wonder if we overbuilt this? Kale looked up from the display. Overbuilt? 2,000 defense platforms. A hidden fleet. A tactical AI capable of running the entire network. She gestured toward the empty corridor on the screen. All for something that might never happen. Kale stared at the map for a long moment. Then he said something very simple. Deterrence only works if it's real. Park nodded slowly. The room fell silent again. Outside the asteroid station, the Vega corridor remained quiet. Ships moved through distant systems. Stars burned steadily. Nothing unusual appeared on the sensors. But deep inside the command center, every officer present understood something important. The declaration had not been a gamble. It had been the final step of a plan that had begun decades earlier. And somewhere beyond the Terran boundary, someone was already deciding whether to test it. 6 months after the Terran declaration, the conversation returned to the imperial court of the sovereign hegemony. This time, no one was laughing. The hall was enormous, as it always had been. Black marble floors stretched across the chamber like still water, reflecting the tall pillars that supported the vaulted ceiling. Along the sides of the room stood rows of advisors, military officers, and ministers dressed in ceremonial robes. But the mood was different. The Terran Declaration had not faded. It had not been forgotten. And more importantly, other civilizations had begun talking about it. At the center of the chamber, seated on the raised throne carved from dark stone, Emperor Varric Sallant his 4 watched the room quietly. He tapped one finger slowly against the arm of his chair. Across from him stood Grand Admiral Thessaler, commander of the Imperial Deep Fleet. Thessaler was everything an Imperial officer was expected to be. Impeccably dressed in dark naval uniform, decorated with enough medals to cover half his chest. He had commanded fleets for 40 years, and he had never lost a battle. The Emperor spoke first. The humans, Varric said slowly, have been broadcasting their declaration for 6 months. Yes, Majesty, Thessaler replied. And other governments are beginning to wonder why we have not responded. The Emperor's voice carried no anger, but the question itself hung in the air like a blade. Thessaler straightened slightly. There has been no need to respond, Majesty. A declaration from a minor species in a small corner of space does not require immediate action from the hegemony. Several advisors nodded quietly, but the Emperor's finger continued tapping. And yet, Varric said, we are still discussing it. Silence settled over the chamber. Thessaler chose his next words carefully. The galaxy is watching, he said. If we allow a young civilization to dictate navigation restrictions in open space, others may begin to wonder if our authority has limits. The Emperor stopped tapping. That was the real issue. Not the declaration. Not the border. But the example it set. If one species could draw a line and enforce it, others might try the same. Varric leaned forward slightly. What do you propose? Thessaler did not hesitate. We cross the boundary. A murmur spread through the chamber. Not outrage. Interest. The Admiral continued calmly. Not with an invasion force. Not with hostile intent. He gestured toward the holographic star map hovering above the floor. We send a fleet through Terran space. We pass through their territory at standard navigation speed. We make no attempt to hide. No attempt to attack. He looked directly at the Emperor. We simply demonstrate that the hegemony goes where it chooses. The Emperor considered this. And if the humans resist? Thessaler's expression did not change. Then we deal with them. The room went quiet again. One of the older advisors stepped forward from the edge of the chamber. Councillor Brix had served 3 emperors and survived every political purge that had occurred during that time. He was small, soft-spoken, and rarely interrupted military discussions. But tonight he did. With respect, Majesty, Brix said carefully. The Emperor turned his head slightly. Yes, Councillor? Our long-range sensor posts near the Terran border have detected irregular energy readings over the past several months. Thessaler didn't even look at him. Sensor ghosts, the Admiral said flatly. Probably gravitational interference from nearby star clusters. Brix frowned slightly. The readings appear in multiple locations and follow no known astronomical pattern. Which means they are noise, Thessaler replied. Our technical teams reviewed the data and found no indication of military activity. Brix opened his mouth to continue. The Emperor raised one hand. That will be enough. Brix bowed his head and stepped back. Varric looked down at the star map again. At the glowing red sphere surrounding Terran space. A young civilization. A bold declaration. A challenge. Finally, the Emperor spoke. Prepare a fleet. Thessaler inclined his head. How many ships, Majesty? The Emperor leaned back in his chair. How many will it take to make the point clear? The Admiral answered immediately. 500. A few of the ministers shifted uneasily. 500 warships was not a patrol. It was a statement. But the Emperor nodded slowly. Very well. His gaze hardened. You will cross the Terran boundary in 60 days. You will travel through their territory openly. You will not fire first. He paused. But if they fire on you? The meaning hung unfinished in the air. Thessaler placed his fist against his chest. As the Emperor commands. The fleet gathers. 3 light years from the Terran border, the Imperial Expeditionary Fleet assembled. 500 ships. Battleships. Heavy cruisers. Destroyers. Carrier platforms. Logistics vessels. The formation stretched across millions of kilometers of space. From a distance, the fleet looked like a cluster of stars moving slowly through the dark. On the bridge of the flagship Eternal Dominion, Grand Admiral Thessaler studied the tactical display. Every ship was in position, every formation line perfectly aligned. He opened a fleet-wide communication channel. "Commanders of the Sovereign Hegemony Expeditionary Fleet," he said. His voice echoed across 500 bridges simultaneously. "In 12 hours we will cross the boundary that the Terran government claims as sovereign territory." He paused. "We do not cross it as conquerors. We cross it to demonstrate a simple truth." The fleet listened in silence. The galaxy does not belong to those who shout the loudest. It belongs to those strong enough to stand where they choose. The admiral leaned forward slightly in his command chair. "If the humans are wise, they will stand aside. If they are not..." His voice remained perfectly calm. "Then the responsibility for what follows will be theirs." He closed the channel. Around him, officers returned to their stations. Navigation routes updated. Sensor arrays calibrated. Weapons remained powered down. Because this was not supposed to be a battle. It was supposed to be a lesson. 12 hours later, the first Imperial ship crossed the red line. And nothing happened. The first Imperial ship crossed the Terran boundary at exactly 3:14 Fleet Standard Time. On the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, the moment passed almost unnoticed. A navigation officer quietly confirmed the coordinates. "Flagship has crossed the Terran boundary." Grand Admiral Thessaler did not react. "Continue course." Behind him, the tactical display showed the enormous Imperial formation sliding forward through the dark. 500 ships. A wall of metal and firepower capable of crushing most civilizations in the known galaxy. And now it was moving calmly, confidently, into space that had been declared forbidden. The stars ahead looked exactly the same as the stars behind. No alarms. No warnings. No human ships. The fleet continued deeper. Day 1. After the first hour, Thessaler stood from his command chair and walked slowly across the bridge. "Any transmissions from Terran Command?" The communications officer shook his head. "None, sir." "Any sensor contacts?" "Negative." The admiral allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Exactly as he had predicted. The humans had made a loud declaration for political reasons, but they had no intention of enforcing it against a fleet this large. Across the fleet formation, officers relaxed slightly. Several ships began transmitting routine navigation logs back toward the Imperial relay network. The message would reach the Emperor within a few hours. "The humans are not responding." 24 hours later, the fleet had traveled nearly a full light year inside Terran space. Still nothing. No ships. No messages. No warnings. Even the younger officers on the flagship bridge began to look slightly bored. Then something small appeared on the long-range sensors. A brief energy reading. Cadet Mara Solon noticed it first. She sat at the long-range sensor console near the back of the bridge. 23 years old. Fresh out of the Imperial Naval Academy. Assigned to the flagship as part of her first field rotation. Her instructors had always said she had an unusual ability to read sensor patterns. The reading lasted less than 2 seconds. A tiny spike of energy in a sector of space where nothing should exist. Mara frowned slightly and tapped the console. Sensor ghost. The system classified automatically. The reading vanished. She made a small note in her personal observation log. Then she returned to monitoring the fleet perimeter. No one else noticed. Day 3. The fleet moved deeper into the Vega corridor. It was a perfect route. Efficient. Navigation computers had selected it automatically. Mara had been monitoring her console for 14 hours when the second anomaly appeared. Another energy spike. Different direction. Different distance. Again it lasted only seconds. Again the system dismissed it as interference. She logged it. 2 hours later, a third reading appeared. This one lasted almost 4 seconds before disappearing. Mara leaned forward slightly. Her fingers moved quickly across the display, reviewing the timestamps. 3 anomalies. 3 different sectors. 3 different distances. She frowned. Individually, the readings meant nothing. But together, they felt wrong. She opened her mouth to speak. then hesitated. She was a cadet. The Grand Admiral himself was standing on the bridge less than 15 meters away. Reporting sensor ghosts would sound like nervousness. She closed her mouth. Instead, she began quietly marking each anomaly in her personal log. By the end of the day, there were 11. The message. Late on the third day, a transmission arrived. The signal appeared suddenly across the fleet communications network. Standard open broadcast frequency. Perfect translation. Every ship in the formation received it simultaneously. The message contained only one sentence. You are in Terran sovereign space. You were warned. Turn back now or face total response. Silence filled the flagship bridge. Thessaler listened to the message without moving. When it ended, the communications officer turned toward him. Orders, sir? The admiral gave a short breath through his nose. Not quite a laugh. Log it. Continue course. The officer nodded. Acknowledged. The fleet kept moving. Something is wrong. Mara Solon stared at her console. Her sensor logs were open across the screen. 11 anomalies. Now 12. A new energy spike had just appeared. Closer this time. Closer than any of the previous readings. Her fingers moved rapidly across the display. She began mapping the anomaly locations, plotting their positions around the fleet. At first the points looked random, but the longer she stared, the more uncomfortable she became. The readings weren't random. They were moving. Not physically moving through space, but appearing in new locations. As if something invisible was scanning the fleet. Her stomach tightened. She checked the sensors again. No interference. No errors. Everything was functioning perfectly. And that meant one thing. The readings were real. Before she could decide whether to report it, her entire display changed. Every sensor alert on the console activated at once. Contact warnings flooded the screen. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Mara's voice came out sharper than she intended. Contacts. The entire bridge turned toward her. Her hands moved automatically, verifying the readings. Multiple contacts appearing across all sectors. The system began counting, then stopped, because the number kept increasing faster than the computer could track. She swallowed. Over 2,000 stationary objects, weapons, platforms. Her voice lowered slightly. They were already here. The bridge fell silent. Grand Admiral Thessaler stepped forward slowly. He looked down at her display, at the massive ring of contacts surrounding the Imperial fleet. And for the first time since entering Terran space, the Admiral stopped smiling. For several seconds, the bridge of the Eternal Dominion remained completely silent. Cadet Mara Solon stared at her sensor display, watching the number of contacts continue climbing as more objects appeared on the tactical grid. 2,000. 2,100. 2,200. The system finally stopped updating when the processing load reached its limit. The screen stabilized, showing the Imperial fleet at the center of a vast sphere of stationary objects. Grand Admiral Thessaler leaned forward slightly. Confirm the readings. Mara's fingers moved across the console. She ran the full diagnostic sequence. Sensor calibration. Signal interference checks. Cross-verification with secondary arrays. Everything came back the same. She swallowed. Readings confirmed, sir. The tactical officer moved closer to her station. What are they? Mara zoomed in on the nearest object. The image resolved slowly as the sensors focused. A dark metallic structure hung motionless in space, roughly 300 meters across, covered in layered armor plating and weapon housings. The tactical officer's voice dropped. Weapons platform. Mara nodded. And there are thousands of them. The bridge fell quiet again, because the meaning of that number was impossible to ignore. 2,000 platforms meant something else. Preparation. Long-term preparation. The kind that took years. Maybe decades. Thessaler's eyes moved across the display. The platforms were positioned in a perfect sphere around the Imperial formation. Every direction. Every escape route. Every possible vector of retreat. All covered. He spoke slowly. How did we not see them? Mara answered before anyone else could. They were hidden. She enlarged the sensor data. Some kind of advanced signal baffling system. It masked their energy output until it was deactivated. The tactical officer looked at the readings. Meaning, they've been here the entire time. A cold realization moved through the bridge crew. The Imperial fleet hadn't just flown into enemy territory. They had flown into a trap that had been waiting for them. The second wave. Before anyone could respond, another alert appeared. This one came from the long-range sensors. Mara's display expanded automatically. Her eyes widened. New contacts. The tactical officer looked up sharply. How many? She began counting. 40, 60, 80. Her voice dropped. They're moving. The new contacts were not stationary platforms. They were ships. Dark shapes emerging from deeper inside the corridor. At first only a few appeared. Then more. Then dozens. Within seconds the tactical display showed over 100 Terran warships approaching from multiple directions. Their formation was precise. Perfectly coordinated. As if every movement had been rehearsed. Which Mara realized with growing dread. It probably had been. These ships weren't detected earlier either, she said. They were using the same cloaking system as the platforms. The tactical officer stared at the display. That means they've been sitting out there. Waiting, Mara finished quietly. The corridor closes. Alarms suddenly began sounding across the bridge. Gravity spikes detected, the navigation officer shouted. Mara's screen flashed again. Several massive objects deployed from the outer ring of platforms. Energy signatures surged. Artificial gravity fields activated. The navigation officer's voice rose sharply. They've deployed gravity anchors. The tactical officer swore under his breath. Gravity anchors were enormous devices capable of manipulating local gravitational fields. They were used to disrupt faster-than-light travel. To trap ships inside specific regions of space. And right now, several of them were activating simultaneously. The display changed again. Every escape vector from the corridor turned red. Navigation paths collapsed. Jump coordinates failed to resolve. The fleet was trapped. Mara whispered the realization out loud. The corridor. Thessaler turned toward her. Yes. It wasn't just a natural route. She zoomed out the map. The Vega corridor appeared as a narrow channel between two dense star clusters. Perfect for large fleets. Perfect for fast transit. But now the shape looked different. The corridor was actually a box. The clusters formed natural walls. The platforms formed artificial ones. And the gravity anchors sealed the exits. She finished the sentence slowly. They built the corridor as a trap. Silence spread across the bridge. Because suddenly everything made sense. The empty space. The lack of response. The sensor ghosts. The perfect navigation route. The Imperial fleet had not chosen the corridor. The corridor had been designed so fleets would choose it. And humanity had spent 20 years preparing the moment when someone finally did. The voice. Another alert appeared. The communications officer looked up. Receiving a transmission. Source. Thessaler asked. Directional signal. Targeted specifically at this ship. The admiral straightened. Put it through. The speakers across the bridge activated. A human voice filled the room. Measured. Perfectly fluent in Imperial standard. Grand Admiral Thessaler, the voice said. My name is Admiral Darius Kale of the Terran Defense Forces. The bridge crew listened in silence. You are currently surrounded by a portion of the Terran defense grid. The display behind Mara confirmed it. Thousands of weapon platforms. Hundreds of hidden warships. Every one of them targeting the Imperial fleet. The voice continued. These systems have been active and in position since before your fleet crossed our boundary. A short pause. You cannot count them all because their number exceeds the tracking capacity of your sensor network. Mara looked at her console. The Admiral was right. The system had stopped counting at 2,000. The voice resumed. You were warned 6 months ago. You were warned again 3 hours ago. You chose not to turn back. The tone remained calm. Completely without anger. That was your decision. Another pause. Then the words that made every officer on the bridge stand a little straighter. I am offering you one final opportunity. Order your fleet to stop. Power down your weapons and prepare to be escorted out of Terran space. You and your crews will not be harmed. Your ships will not be destroyed. You will be released at the boundary. The voice paused one last time. This offer will remain open for 10 minutes. After that, the next sentence came quietly. But after that, the grid activates. And I cannot promise you anything. The transmission ended. The bridge of the Eternal Dominion fell into absolute silence. 500 Imperial warships sat trapped inside a corridor filled with thousands of Terran weapons. And the countdown had begun. The silence on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion lasted several seconds after the transmission ended. Every officer stared at the tactical display. 2,000 Terran weapons platforms. More than 100 warships closing in from 6 directions. Gravity anchors sealing every escape route. The Imperial fleet was completely surrounded. Cadet Mara Solon could hear her own heartbeat. 10 minutes. That was the window Admiral Kale had given them. 10 minutes to decide whether 500 ships lived or died. Grand Admiral Thessaler stood perfectly still in the center of the bridge. His face showed no fear, no uncertainty, but his eyes moved quickly across the display. Calculating, assessing, searching for weakness. There had to be one. Empires did not fall into traps. Empires broke them. The tactical officer spoke carefully. Sir, if the grid activates, the fleet will be engaging multiple targets simultaneously. He hesitated. Thousands of targets. Thessaler did not look away from the display. Can we break through? The officer studied the map. The platforms formed a layered defensive ring. Behind them, the Terran warships were already maneuvering into optimal firing positions. And the gravity anchors ensured no ship could jump to faster-than-light travel. After several seconds, the officer answered honestly. Not without heavy losses. How heavy? Another pause. The officer swallowed. Unknown. Across the bridge, the communications officer spoke again. Sir, the Terrans are not powering weapons. Thessaler turned slightly. Confirm. Confirmed. Their platforms remain active but not firing. They're waiting. Mara stared at her console. Her sensor display showed the entire Terran defense grid. Every platform was locked onto Imperial targets. Every Terran ship had firing solutions ready. But none of them had opened fire. They were giving the fleet a choice. She remembered the voice on the transmission. Professional. Not threatening. Simply stating facts. You were warned. Turn back now. Her stomach tightened. She knew what the logical choice was. Withdraw. Leave the corridor. Report what they had discovered. But logic was not the only force on the bridge. Pride stood there too. Pride wearing the uniform of a Grand Admiral. Thessaler finally spoke. Time remaining? 7 minutes, the communications officer replied. The Admiral slowly walked back toward his command chair. He sat down, folded his hands, looked once more at the massive Terran defense network surrounding his fleet. 500 Imperial warships. The most powerful expeditionary force the hegemony had deployed in decades. Turning back now would mean something worse than defeat. It would mean humiliation. Across the entire galaxy. He spoke quietly. Signal the fleet. The communications officer looked up. Yes, sir. Battle stations. The bridge erupted into motion. Officers rushed to their consoles. Weapons systems activated. Shield generators surged to full output. Across 500 ships, alarms sounded simultaneously. Cadet Mara Solon closed her eyes briefly. She had known the decision was coming, but knowing it didn't make it easier. The communications officer hesitated for just a moment. The Terran offer? Thessaler's voice cut through the room like steel. Signal the fleet. The officer obeyed. Fleet-wide order, battle stations. The message raced across the Imperial formation. Weapons arrays powered up. Targeting systems locked onto the nearest Terran platforms. The quiet tension inside the corridor snapped. Mara stared at the countdown timer still running on her console. 4 minutes left. Thessaler leaned forward slightly in his chair. Target the nearest platform cluster. The tactical officer nodded. Targets acquired. Fire. The first shot of the battle came from the Imperial fleet. A destroyer on the outer edge of the formation opened fire. Lances of energy streaked across the darkness toward the nearest Terran platforms. They struck perfectly. Direct hits. Explosions blossomed across the platform shields. The Imperial gunners adjusted their targeting, preparing to fire again. But they never got the chance. Because the Terran grid activated. Every platform lit up simultaneously. Thousands of weapon systems firing in perfect synchronization. Not chaotic. Not random. Precise. Each platform targeting specific ships. Each volley calculated by the AI coordinating the entire defense network. Cadet Mara Solon watched the sensor display explode with activity. Targets disappearing. Imperial ships vanishing from the map. The first destroyer that had fired its weapons lasted less than 4 seconds. Then it was gone. And the battle for the Vega corridor truly began. What followed happened so fast that Cadet Mara Solon would later struggle to describe it accurately. The first Terran return volley crossed the distance between the platforms and the Imperial fleet in less than a second. The destroyer that had fired the opening shot never had time to raise its shields to full strength. 3 energy lances struck its hull in perfect sequence. The first collapsed the shields. The second tore through the engine core. The third split the ship in half. The destroyer vanished from the tactical display. And then the rest of the Terran grid opened fire. Thousands of weapons platforms fired in carefully timed waves. Not a single shot wasted. Each platform targeting a different vessel. Each firing sequence calculated by Aegis, the Terran tactical AI coordinating the entire defense grid. On the Imperial bridge, alarms exploded across every console. Ship destroyed. Multiple impacts on the outer formation. Shield failures. Missile swarms detected. The tactical officer shouted over the chaos. Return fire. All ships engage. The Imperial fleet answered. Hundreds of warships unleashed their weapons at once. Beams. Missiles. Rail cannon rounds streaking across the void. For a moment the darkness of space lit up like a star-going nova. Several Terran platforms disappeared in bursts of fire. But for every one destroyed, 10 more continued firing. The grid had depth. Layers of defenses placed at different ranges. Each layer adjusting automatically as the battle evolved. And then the Terran warships arrived. Mara's display lit up with new movement vectors. Over 100 Terran vessels surged forward from deeper inside the corridor. Long, dark hulls. Extremely fast. Their acceleration curves didn't match anything in the Imperial tactical models. New contacts closing, she shouted. Speed. High, very high. They'll be in weapons range in 20 seconds. Grand Admiral Thessaler stood in the center of the bridge issuing orders rapidly. Titan formation. Cruisers to forward shield positions. Carrier groups deploy fighters. Hundreds of Imperial fighters launched from the fleet. Swarms of small craft racing toward the Terran platforms. But the grid had already anticipated the move. Automated defense systems activated across the platforms. Missile batteries fired. Point defense cannons roared. Entire fighter wings vanished before reaching their targets. And then the Terran ships opened fire. Their weapons were different. Not the heavy beams favored by the hegemony. Instead they fired rapid sequences of smaller, hyper-accelerated projectiles. The shots struck with terrifying accuracy. One Imperial cruiser lost its engines in the first volley. Another had its shield generators surgically destroyed. A third was struck along its weapon mounts and went dark within seconds. These attacks weren't random. They were precise dismemberments. The Terran ships weren't just destroying vessels. They were disabling them, cutting away the fleet's ability to maneuver. The corridor becomes a killing ground. Within minutes the Vega corridor turned into chaos. Imperial ships attempted to maneuver out of the trap. But every direction was blocked. Gravity anchors distorted space around the fleet, preventing faster-than-light escape. Platforms covered every retreat path, and the Terran warships moved like predators circling trapped prey. Mara watched the tactical map change faster than her system could fully update. 500 ships. The numbers kept dropping. She whispered under her breath. This can't be happening. The Imperial fleet was one of the most powerful forces in the galaxy. But here, inside this corridor, they were fighting an enemy that had been preparing this battlefield for 20 years. Every maneuver Thessaler ordered was anticipated seconds before it happened, because Aegis was predicting fleet movements in real time. Every time an Imperial squadron shifted formation, Terran platforms adjusted firing patterns instantly. Every time a cruiser attempted to break through the grid, gravity anchors shifted the local field to disrupt its engines. Every attempt to escape was already accounted for. This wasn't just a defense. It was a designed battlefield. The realization. 3 hours into the battle, Mara began to understand something terrifying. The Terrans were not trying to annihilate the entire fleet. If they were, the Imperial losses would have been far worse already. So, they were dismantling the fleet slowly, systematically. Ships that lost engines were left drifting. Ships with destroyed weapons were ignored. Only vessels that continued firing were destroyed. She looked at the casualty counter again. 317 ships destroyed. 183 still operational. The number stopped falling. The firing slowed. And for the first time since the battle began, the Terran fleet stopped advancing. The bridge of the Eternal Dominion was filled with smoke and emergency lights. Several consoles were dark. The flagship had taken multiple hits. Its port-side weapon systems were gone. Engine output had dropped by 40%, but the ship was still alive. Mara looked toward the center of the bridge. Grand Admiral Thessaler stood there silently. His tactical display showed the truth clearly. The remaining Imperial ships were surrounded, outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and completely trapped. For the first time in his 40-year career, the Grand Admiral understood something. This battle had been lost before it began. So he spoke. All ships. His voice was quiet now. Stand down. Across the Imperial fleet, weapons powered down. One by one, the surviving ships stopped firing. The battle for the Vega corridor ended. After 11 hours of combat, and the galaxy's most powerful fleet had just learned a brutal lesson. Humanity had not drawn a line in space as a bluff. They had drawn it as a promise point. 30 minutes after the Imperial fleet powered down its weapons, a small Terran shuttle approached the Eternal Dominion. No escort. No weapons deployed. Just a single shuttle moving calmly through the battlefield that only hours earlier had been filled with fire and debris. The remains of destroyed ships drifted silently between the surviving vessels. Broken hull sections. Shattered fighter craft. Emergency beacons blinking weakly in the dark. Across the Imperial fleet, damage reports continued arriving. Life support failures. Engine cores offline. Hull breaches sealed with emergency foam. But something unexpected was happening. Terran ships were moving among them. Not attacking. Helping. Rescue craft were retrieving Imperial survivors from damaged vessels. Medical transports were docking with ships that had injured crews. Supply shuttles were delivering power cells and emergency repair kits. The Terrans were treating the defeated fleet not as enemies to be punished, but as sailors who had survived a disaster. Inside the conference chamber of the Eternal Dominion, Grand Admiral Thessaler waited. The doors opened quietly. Admiral Darius Kale stepped inside. He was smaller than Thessaler had imagined. No ceremonial armor. No elaborate uniform. Just a simple Terran naval jacket with minimal rank markings. 2 officers followed him into the room. They carried no visible weapons. Kale walked calmly to the center table and sat down. Thessaler took the opposite seat. For several seconds neither man spoke. They simply looked at each other. 2 commanders who had just fought one of the largest battles in recent galactic history. Finally Kale spoke. Grand Admiral. Thessaler inclined his head slightly. Admiral. Kale folded his hands on the table. I'm not here to ask for your surrender. That surprised Thessaler slightly. Kale continued. This wasn't a war. He gestured lightly toward the viewport where Terran ships continued moving through the debris field. You entered a region of space that we clearly marked as forbidden. We responded exactly the way we said we would. Thessaler remained silent, because he knew the statement was true. The humans had warned them. Twice. Kale continued. The terms are simple. Your surviving ships will remain in Terran space temporarily while we ensure they are stable enough to travel safely. Medical support and supplies will be provided to all crews. Your personnel will not be harmed. Thessaler studied him carefully. And then? Kale answered calmly. Then your ships will be returned to hegemony territory. Fully operational. The Imperial Admiral raised an eyebrow slightly. You would return our fleet? Yes. Kale leaned back slightly. We're not interested in humiliating you. Only in making something clear. Thessaler already knew what that something was. The boundary, he said. Kale nodded. Exactly. The room fell quiet again. Thessaler finally asked the question that had been bothering him since the battle began. How long? Kale looked at him. How long what? How long have you been preparing this? Kale considered the question. Then answered honestly. 20 years. The number hung in the air. 20 years. 20 years of planning. 20 years of building. 20 years of preparing for exactly the situation that had just unfolded. Thessaler exhaled slowly. That corridor? Yes, Kale said. We left it open on purpose. The Imperial Admiral almost smiled. A trap. A predictable path, Kale corrected. Any large fleet entering Terran space would naturally choose it. Thessaler nodded. He understood now. Everything. The ghost sensor readings. The silent corridor. The sudden appearance of the defense grid. It had all been planned. Finally he asked one more question. The platforms, the fleet, the AI controlling them. Kale watched him quietly. Was that all of it? The Terran Admiral paused. Then he gave a small smile. No. He stood, adjusted the collar of his uniform, and delivered the final line of the conversation. That was about 31%. Thessaler stared at him. Kale walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned slightly. For what it's worth, Grand Admiral, your crews fought well. Any navy would be proud of them. Then he left. The door closed softly behind him. The message reaches the galaxy. Within weeks, news of the battle spread across the galaxy. Merchant captains carried the story from port to port. Diplomatic channels exchanged reports. Intelligence agencies confirmed the numbers. 500 hegemony warships had entered Terran space. 317 had been destroyed. And humanity had still returned the survivors safely. The reaction was immediate. The Breath Collective upgraded humanity's threat classification. The Chorus of Kel called an emergency council session to discuss Terran military capability. The Sun Republic reopened the intelligence report they had previously ignored. And dozens of smaller civilizations quietly began reconsidering their diplomatic relationships with Earth. Because something had become very clear. Humanity had not spent 2 centuries quietly expanding through space out of weakness. They had been building. Back on Earth. Late one night, Secretary General Anika Vasquez stood in her office overlooking the lights of Geneva. The orbital lanes above the planet glowed faintly as cargo transports moved between Earth and the nearby stations. In her hand was a cup of tea. Warm this time. She watched the stars for a long moment. Somewhere out there, the Terran defense grid still waited silently. Thousands of platforms. Hidden fleets. Systems that most of the galaxy still didn't know existed. Humanity had drawn a boundary. And now the galaxy finally understood it. Vasquez took a sip of her tea. They thought our silence meant weakness, she said quietly to the empty room. Her reflection looked back at her from the window. She shook her head slightly. It never did. Outside the window, the stars burned steadily. And somewhere behind the invisible red line surrounding Terran space, humanity kept building.